Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell, and we are here for the seventh and final installment in our little series of webinars and reviews of scholarship on Islam. So let me go ahead and get the screen share going here. Now, as you can tell from your screen, this is part 7, and in this I want to be offering some personal remarks, kind of review. We're going to be talking about all this in the context of American unipolarism, political correctness, and how the media is trying to portray Islam. We're going to be talking in particular about the Treaty or Peace of Westphalia in the year 1648, a series actually of 3 different treaties, but basically establishing the principles of international law that have reigned more or less in the West and most of the rest of the world since this time, and the idea of the nation at war in Islam. So let's begin with these kind of personal observations. Now, I want to stress before I get started here that, again, the amount of reading I did for these webinars totaled well over 1,000 pages and approximately 12 books, although I've been referring basically to 5 books in this series of webinars. Some of the books were extremely technical in nature, but they are worth citing and looking at. You can find many of these works referred to in the 5 sources that I've referred to in these webinars. Now, as I say on the screen here, I've undertaken this very high overview of the problems posed to Islamic orthodoxy by contemporary historical critical scholarship from several motivations. Firstly, I've done so to demonstrate the relevance of meticulous critical, philological, and historical scholarship, and to show that so-called academic ivory tower aloofness has a great deal of relevance to a dangerous political situation that we live in. In short, while the religion of Islam itself is anything but a religion of peace and tolerance, the actual religion and practice of over 1 billion Muslims is another matter. Now, one cannot hope to change the inherent dangers posed by this ideology by force or politics alone. As Ibn Warraq suggested, and as we covered this comment in a previous webinar, this can only come about really by a change in the mind and habits and thoughts of Muslims themselves, and this in turn can only be done by a wider exposure, in my opinion, of such scholarship and its implications to the public. And number 2, I've undertaken these webinars to show that the continuous misportrayal of Islamic theology is either a case of egregious ignorance or a case of willful and deliberate deception, or, as is likely the case, a little bit of both. But on any informed view of Islam version 2.0, the radical Muslim is simply a Muslim taking the tenets of the religion seriously. Then thirdly, on this view, the tenets of Islam version 2.0, the Mohammedan Islamic orthodoxy, with which we identify and by which we understand Islamic culture and religion, are indeed a kind of religiously sanctioned unipolar worldview of their own, with its own geopolitical and cultural imperative to subdue all of humanity to Islam. That non-Islamic world is the nation or house of war, with which Islam is perpetually to be in holy struggle or jihad, until there is, quote, no more persecution, and the religion is Allah's alone, unquote. One must understand that the implications of this cultural unipolarism are evidenced in the actions of the Taliban in Afghanistan, blowing up centuries-old statues of the Buddha. Imagine the same example being applied to the Western cultural heritage. Artistic works from Michelangelo, Botticelli, Poussin, Velázquez, Rembrandt, and so on would have to be destroyed as idolatry, along with works such as Mozart's Requiem, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, much of the compositional output of Johann Sebastian Bach, the Beatles, and countless other groups would similarly face destruction for their non-Islamic and heretical contents, not to mention numerous works of literature, philosophy, and political philosophy. Now, this point, which I don't think we can ponder over too long, was highlighted by Ibn Warraq in the following way. Quote, in 2002, the Rand Corporation published a report that described Saudi Arabia as, quote, the kernel of evil, the prime mover, the most dangerous opponent, unquote. The report went on to explain that, quote, Saudi Arabia supports our enemies and attacks our allies. The Saudis are active at every level of the terror chain, from planners to financiers, from cadre to foot soldier, from ideologist to cheerleader, unquote. And yet little seems to have changed in the West's behavior toward a regime that has financed terrorism, funneled millions into madrasas that preach more anti-Western hatred, has corrupted institutions of higher education like Harvard and Georgetown University, has bought the favors of Western politicians, and seeks to destroy Western civilization at every turn, unquote. Now, this type of divinely sanctioned unipolarism reveals Islam 2.0 as an ideology that, by its moral contradictions and sanctions to mass murder, its sanctions against art and music and their humanizing influences as idolatry, reveal it to be a profoundly anti-human and anti-humanistic ideology. As such, Islam version 2.0 knows of no equivalent principle, and please pay attention now, to the Peace of Westphalia, a principle which is held as the de facto principle of Western international law since its conclusion in 1648. We need, fifthly, to remind ourselves of what this principle was. Cujus regio eius religio, or whose the religion, his the religion. A principle, or pardon me, whose the region, his the religion. A principle that you recall from the second webinar was actually reflected in the Meccan or tolerant verses of the Quran, which were abrogated by the later Medinan sword verses of intolerance. Islam version 2.0 sets its mandate for perpetual jihad against this principle and demonstrates this most recently in Europe, where Islamic communities, once numbers are sufficient, have sought and won the right for Sharia courts to replace local secular law. And this was a clear principle of the treaties of Westphalia, because it was established there that the same secular law would apply both to Protestants and Catholics, and that both parties, whether they were living in a Protestant land as a Catholic minority or as Protestants, a Protestant minority in a Catholic land, would have the same rights under the law. It might be argued that they are following this principle, but in reality, the principle means that the region is that of the sovereign prince and his state, and that if that prince and state are of one religion or no religion, that is the law of the land. It has been said rightly that American unipolarism, and indeed the globalist dogma of the obsolescence of the nation state, have contributed to the demise of this Westphalian principle, and I personally think that it has. And that this, as far as it goes, is true. And thus, this view has contributed its own part to the current dilemma. But this principle did not mean, conversely, that at the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe, the war of religion, that those who were not of the prince's religion were allowed to form ghettos with their own laws and courts in opposition to those of the land. In short, Westphalia laid the basis for the modern secular state with its eventual separation of church and state. Now, sixthly, historically, Islam version 2.0 stands in opposition to this principle, as you can easily see. And this unipolarism, combined with the Western American unipolarism on the other side, makes the contemporary situation both volatile and dangerous. For the latter, on the basis of its own multicultural misreading of the Westphalian principle, has allowed such internal cultural and legal schisms to take place within its borders. And hence, its war on terror has been a half-hearted effort. This misreading has led to the consequence that the true nature of the threat, its threat against its own cultural and artistic heritage, has not been fully appreciated. Islam 2.0's threat is a total one, not just against the institutions of Western culture, but against the artistic and scientific freedoms that have made them possible. For in that orthodoxy, all is subject to the ruling of clerics over each and every innovation. In such a dangerous and cultural geopolitical context, the best weapon is truth and its wide dissemination. Ibn Warq points out the type of hypocrisy reigning both in Western intellectual circles as well as those of liberal Islam in the following words, quote, "This desire to reinterpret has led to some willful and intellectually dishonest rereading of the Quran. Feminists pretend that the real Quran is progressive towards women, believe it or not. Human rights activists pretend, in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that the real Quran is totally compatible with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The reality is that the Quran and the Sharia derived from the Quran are totalitarian constructs that can try to control every single aspect of an individual's life, from the way he or she urinates and defecates, eats, dresses, works, marries, makes love, and prays, to the way he or she thinks on every conceivable subject, unquote. And that's Ibn Warraq, Virgins What Virgins, page 258. In such a unipolar cultural and geopolitical imperative, the Westphalian principle of the equality of religions before the law are rendered de facto null and void, and the principles of reciprocity are similarly voided. The West must tolerate mosques in its midst, while no churches are allowed in lands where Islam 2.0 is practiced in toto, such as Saudi Arabia. In such a dangerous situation, the truth itself, both the historical critical truths of recent scholarship, plus the internal moral and philosophical contradictions within Islam 2.0, form the unitary basis both to expose media-driven wishful thinking about its tenets and to expose the underlying weakness of the historical claims propping up the system itself. Obviously, a few short webinars are of little more than a few hours' length cannot begin to detail the voluminous amount of research and facts that could buttress these types of arguments. But I hope that I have provided an adequate scaffolding for a basic critique that will allow the reader and listener, if he or she is so inclined, to research the matter for themselves and add further details. In short, my final motivation for these webinars is my conviction that not all cultures are created equal, and that our Western culture and heritage is worth defending. We have had our own history of inquisitions, of killing, maiming, burning, and pillaging in the name of religion and of God, and even in the name of atheism. But even at the height of such brutalities in the Western Middle Ages, the perception existed that the Church could not nor should commit such barbarisms, and hence the fiction was devised to hand over heretics to the secular power for corporal or capital punishments, a dim recognition, perhaps, that evil was being done. In the end, that system collapsed when reformers, and more importantly, early Enlightenment scholars, pointed out that that system itself was not part of the original history or teaching. In Islam 2.0, no such system exists, nor is it wanted. Such excesses exist and are indeed commanded by the system itself, and that is the problem. But that system, in turn, exists on the basis of historical claims and a theology of abrogation based upon those claims, and those claims have been found wanting. So that's it, my friends. Those are the requested webinars on Islam. I hope you've enjoyed them. I hope you have found them profitable to some degree. I hope that you will take some of the information about sources I've provided you and go look into these matters for yourself. And I hope that they've been profitable and uplifting in some sense. Anyway, that's it, and I'll see you on the flip side. Bye-bye.